Why Media Group? The fastest growing media group in North America.
Hello and welcome to Y Media Newsroom. I'm Ramona Singh, and on today's show, we're going to cover the fragile Middle East ceasefire that's facing new pressures as the United States and Iran clash over details of potential breakthrough of the agreement. We'll tell you what that all means when it comes to diplomacy, whether it would hold, or maybe another crisis is around the corner, as we've seen this escalation over the last 3 months. Back here at home, we have the political clock ticking for Prime Minister Mark Carney as there's 6 federal by-elections on the horizon, and just one result could determine whether Prime Minister Mark Carney is able to keep his majority in Parliament. And today is Primary Tuesdays. We'll cover what this means for Mamdani's backed candidates in the United States and the shape the midterms elections are taking. And in sports, you have Lionel Messi, who's making history once again, breaking the all-time World Cup scoring record and proving that one of the greatest careers in sports is far from finished. This and much more on Y Media's Newsroom. Now, starting with our top story about what's happening with the US-Iran negotiations, it looks like it's a fragile diplomatic breakthrough between Washington, D.C. and Tehran. As it's beginning to take shape, we covered what took place on day one with Vice President J.D. Vance. And essentially now what's been announced is that the Strait of Hormuz appears to be reopened from the Iranian side, as well as the blockade removed from the American side. And that means billions of dollars in Iranian assets could also be released during these negotiations. And the oil sanctions are easing on Iran. So major disputes remain over one particular thing, which is why this war essentially started last year, the 12-day war, if you recall, in 2025. And in 2026, even though the war started with what President Trump called a regime change, but essentially it was always about nuclear program of Iran, nuclear weapons. It was always about nuclear. So the major dispute remains over nuclear inspections and growing tensions between the Trump administration and Israeli Prime Minister, and over Lebanon that could threaten the entire process. This is what we're keeping an eye on. So essentially, the key point so far is since the MOU was signed by President Trump on the finale day of the G7 back on June 17th, you have the US naval forces that have been removed. The blockade has been removed from the Iranian ports, but the US naval forces still remain in the area, which is perhaps a great idea in case there's an escalation. That will be enforcement for making things go back in terms of the negotiation. But when it comes to commercial shipping, it's expected to resume the way it was prior to the conflict starting on February 28th. And Iran and Oman are discussing long-term mechanisms to manage traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. President Trump did say it's going to be toll-free, and that is something that is happening right now, but it will determine the future within the next 30 to 60 days of what it means for that strait, and if there will be a toll, fixed by the Iranians as well as the Omanis, which are at the tip of the Strait of Hormuz. And even at that, you had President Trump say that, maybe America will manage the Strait of Hormuz and charge tolls. So it seems like it's part of the conversation that might come up as talks resume. And hundreds of vessels remain stranded waiting for full normalization. That's been the case for the last 3 months. And so this is a time where we're seeing, the Americans and the Iranians at the table discussing some of these strategies and some of these key concerns. But what is of the biggest issue is that essentially, will Iran open up to have inspections of its nuclear facilities? It's really the biggest concern right now. When it comes to Strait of Hormuz, well, because it handles 20% of the global oil shipments, that essentially what President Trump noticed by watching the markets, that every time there was a proper announcement that it's open, and that when escalations continued, he saw the oil prices raise. And he even mentioned it. He says, the market reacts. And essentially, he said, prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz would essentially drive oil prices significantly higher than we saw them at its peak during these last 3 months, and increased inflation globally. In Canada, we saw inflation numbers go up every month from February onwards until the latest numbers at 3.2%. And those are May's numbers. That's here in Canada. And it's also being experienced in the United States. And President Trump also said that, this threatens global supply chains is very disruptive to the global economy. So it was of the main concern to make sure that the Strait of Hormuz is reopened and is being seen as a major de-escalation step between the countries, and that Iran is, actually getting along and going along with what they promised in terms of allowing the Strait of Hormuz to remain open. Now, when it comes to the biggest dispute, which we're all watching to see how these negotiations go and why this whole thing even started, is a dispute over nuclear inspections now. So President Trump claims that Iran has agreed to the highest level of nuclear inspections, those are his terms, and expanded monitoring by international inspectors. Meanwhile, Iranian officials are saying publicly that they're rejecting this characterization by President Trump. And they're saying that there's no inspection schedule that exists, there's no final agreement that's been reached with the IAEA, and any inspections must be approved under Iranian law. So it seems like both sides appear to have different interpretations of what was agreed in Switzerland, and this could become one of the biggest obstacles to this final deal. But what we're seeing take place, because this MOU that's been signed by all parties, is that there will be $12 billion of frozen assets that are part of this agreement phase of negotiations. So the Iranian parliament speaker and top negotiator Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf said that agreement has been reached, and to be released in terms of the initial package will be first $12 billion in frozen Iranian assets, then a potential future relief of up to $50 billion if a final agreement is reached. Now, the major disagreement on the assets being released is the United States. Their position is that the funds must remain in controlled accounts. And the US stance is that the funds should be spent primarily on food, medicine, and approved purchases, potentially be directed towards US agriculture exports in a way of doing this deal. Meanwhile, Iran is saying, well, no, the money belongs to Iran, and therefore Tehran will decide how it'll spend it, and there should be no restrictions upon receiving its own money. So there's a little bit of a difference there in terms of what to do with that money. And so we're watching in terms of how this issue will also be resolved. When it comes to oil sanctions relief, this is something Iran pushed significantly, and it's one of the most significant developments, essentially receiving less attention than some of the other items. But the United States has reportedly issued a waiver allowing Iran to sell oil more freely through the month of August. So, why this is so important? It's because for years, Iran has sold its oil at a heavy discount due to sanctions. And so this means that Iran may now sell its oil at market prices and access US dollar transactions and increase oil revenues dramatically. So this could inject billions of dollars in Iran's economy. And one of the major factors during this negotiations that we've been watching, and we've been watching for the last 3 months, even since the ceasefire started back in April 8th, is Lebanon. And this being the major flashpoint of this entire issue is that, the biggest strategic tension is now between Washington, D.C. and Jerusalem when it comes to Iran. So you have the US-Iran MOU, which is supposed to include Lebanon. And this agreement reportedly commits parties to end hostilities in Lebanon and respect Lebanese sovereignty and prevent any future escalations. Meanwhile, Israel's position under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is that he insists that Israeli troops will remain in southern Lebanon. They moved the escalations between Hezbollah in Lebanon and Israeli forces began early March, shortly after the war with Iran on February 28th. You could say about March 2nd, 3rd. the escalation started with Lebanon. And since then, the Israeli forces have moved into the southern Lebanon to the Litani River, essentially 14% of Lebanon's land. And they call it a buffer zone to be able to fight Hezbollah. But this is part of the agreement in the MOU that Israeli soldiers must withdraw from Lebanon's land and not be there in terms of an occupation. So this is something that the Prime Minister of Israel saying that he will not do, that he will keep his troops in southern Lebanon, that Israel retains full freedom of action as it's a sovereign country, and that operations against Hezbollah will continue if deemed necessary. So a hard line stance against the president's MOU that the president signed. And this is what we're seeing in terms of the friction between the two countries, given that they're both, they call each other the greatest allies. That's the United States and Israel. And now you're seeing a friction in terms of Israel deciding to do, in terms of with the prime minister deciding to say what they're going to do in part ways from what President Trump has essentially negotiated and signed. So this growing friction that we're watching is essentially, the main issue for Israelis as well, where perhaps Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu could be worrying about the US's, US trying to constrain Israeli military actions in Lebanon, as well as Iran gaining potentially influence through diplomacy with the United States and the GCC7 countries, as well as Lebanon. Negotiations may limit Israel's strategic options in terms of what it had already planned to do in southern Lebanon. So we're watching this all escalate all at the same time and affecting many different regional points. Now, Israeli forces opened fire in southern Lebanon. That still is continuing, regardless of this MOU that President Trump has signed. And so far, the news reports have come out that two people were killed. Hezbollah called it a ceasefire violation, and Iran has warned any further attacks on Lebanon could affect broader negotiations. We saw that take place where Iran, after it opened the Strait of Hormuz, it quickly closed it. And then you had President Trump make threats to Iran and Israel and everybody else that was involved. So we're seeing all these escalation points, and that was during, Vice President J.D. Vance, who was doing the negotiations with the Iranian counterparts and with the Qataris there, as well as the Pakistanis there, to be able to moderate and mediate the entire negotiations. So what we're watching is, United States is essentially looking for, Strait of Hormuz to be opened, for there to be reduced regional war risk, and for there to be potential nuclear inspections. That's part of the key aspects, and energy market stabilizing. And what Iran gets out of all of this entire deal is having its frozen funds released and having oil sanctions waived, as well as expanded oil exports and the recognition as a negotiating partner at the table with the United States. Meanwhile, Israel's concern is that they're seeing that Washington is trading potentially military pressure on Iran and Hezbollah for what appears to be diplomatic stability in the region and with Iran, perhaps even legitimizing the Iranian regime. So that is part of what is unfolding right now. And this explains the increasing public disagreements that we're watching between President Trump's administration, because we've heard even Vice President J.D. Vance speak critically of Israel lately, which is something that you never saw before. And also with the Israeli Prime Minister speak very critically about what his mission is in Lebanon and his dealings there. So this is all part of what we are right now focused on. Of course, this is evolving, and we'll bring you the latest as it unfolds. Now, there are critics that say Ottawa is delaying Foreign Influence Registry. So now this debate centers on Ottawa's Foreign Influence Transparency and Accountability Act, called FITAA. And this legislation was passed back in 2024, and it would require individuals and organizations acting on behalf of foreign governments or foreign state-linked entities to register their activities publicly. However, nearly 2 years later, since it was signed and brought in 2024, the registry still is not operational because of the final regulations that have not been implemented yet. So now critics are saying that the Liberal government is essentially slow walking this entire thing, saying that the registry is really needed at a time when Canada is facing renewed concerns about foreign interference. And now you have what Quebec could be moving towards a possible sovereignty referendum debate. And they said that that's going to be part of, what the outcome of their provincial election is going to be, and that is this fall. And then you also have what's happening with Alberta's referendum that is scheduled on October 19th. So this is very concerning for Canadians because you have several national security experts and diaspora groups and democracy advocates that are arguing that Canada remains an outlier among major allies by not having a functional foreign influence registry. And intelligence agencies continue to warn that foreign interference efforts by countries like China, Russia, and Iran remain very active. So this is at a time where, you have the commissioner. It's already designated to oversee the registry. Former BC Chief Electoral Officer Antoine Bogman has been approved, but cannot fully assume his role until regulations are finalized. So without the registry, Canadians have less visibility into lobbying, advocacy, or political activities that are being conducted on behalf of foreign states here in Canada, which is very alarming. So now the government's position has been so far that public safety officials are saying that the regulations are in the final stages of development and that the government expects to move ahead very soon. So now Ottawa has already begun, they said that they've begun establishing the commissioner's office. And the government argues that the regulations must be carefully designed to avoid unintended consequences for legitimate community organizations, diaspora groups, and international business activities. So this is something that we're watching. And now why Quebec is part of this discussion is because there's concern that is heightened because of the Paul St. Pierre Plamond-led party in Quebecois that has pledged to hold a referendum on Quebec sovereignty if elected in the next provincial election. Now, critics argue that any major constitutional debate could become a target for foreign influence campaigns, making transparency mechanisms a lot more important and much, for what it would be in terms of what the voters are going to be exposed to. Now, the proposed registry would be similar to systems already operating in what we see in the United States when it comes to FARA or Australia or the United Kingdom, and people acting under the direction of a foreign government or state-linked entities in politics, in political lobbying, communications, or influence activities would also have to disclose their relationships very quickly. And so this is something that we're watching to see how fast Ottawa is going to be moving forward. We're going to take a quick break and we're going to come back and talk about Prime Minister Mark Carney and what appears to be his slimming majority.